Now, Stephen, floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexei. And one more time, just because I give you multiple biographies, remember that I'm not a Twitter intellectual. I am on Twitter quite a lot, mobilizing protest and resistance, and I'll talk a little bit about the content. If you follow me on Twitter, that's the main platform, but it really is a way to connect people. I'm followed by bureau chiefs, political scientists, diplomats, official and non-official, activists, grassroots democracy activists, and above all, Ukrainians, whom I really respect and want to get out the message, the analysis, the expertise that counts. I was very much resistant to being on the platform of Twitter. It was during the Trump years. I saw the worst of Donald Trump after he was elected in 2016. I was very happy when he was deplatformed. I'm very unhappy that Elon Musk has come to own the platform and that Donald Trump, of course, is running for office in 2024. This is the main contingency for me as an American to understand Ukraine right now. But what I'm going to do in this small little sound map of time, as I call it, is give you an opening libretto for our conference. I would like you to think about this as almost like a prose poem, a way to understand the content and the worlds that you've experienced in very, very different ways since February 24th, 2022, in coming here to Chisinau today. On the night of February 23rd, 24th, I collected all kinds of fears as I thought about genocide and death. Life has an odd way of being reduced. We try to make it more complicated by writing history books or dealing in lessons never to repeat or speaking of roadmaps. These things keep the gears of academia grinding, but it's not normal. These things provide a diplomat's practical orientation. We sit at universities, in libraries, cafes, offices, doing work, and this is not normal. For me, and for so many other Ukrainians identifying with a political community and a civil society, regardless of our religion, confession, background, gender, or sexuality, life stopped on February 24th, 2022. We entered a new time, history, and space, with chessboards and pipelines, geoeconomics and Archimedean points, seeing like a state, seeing like a god. Gods and maps can kill you. Unchecked mono-civilizational maps that eliminate entire countries and cultures. Nations racially constituted get unduly labeled by ethnicity and nationality, with fixed biographies, east-west gradients, bold immovable lines, geopolitics into red, blue states and red lines, conflicts that come at you in 2 dimensions. Humans get beaten up, erased by bullies, thugs and dictators. Mixed regions like Halichina, Galicia, or Donbass, renamed, reincorporated, conquered, and oversimplified with histories of settlement rather than movable borderlands with movable people in movable maps. The violence that's there in every map and every claim to territory, whether it's indigenous territory or settled or not, it's there. This violence in claims that aren't just maps. Maps are very, very fragile as artifacts, tools, and devices for propaganda. They drag us in, all these maps of Ukraine. They stoke our raw fears, our jealousy, and they give us supply. Until we make a choice about our values, whether to retreat or collaborate, be silent or resist. What moved you here today? How did you get here? Who made that choice? My opening talk for you is a sound map of time, without the lazy PowerPoint that at least a generation of professors at universities thinking about normal things rely on. Our offices were destroyed by missiles. Listen to the sounds. Hear the sirens. Close your eyes. Don't use your eyes. Know the deaths beyond the numbers. Keep track of names, not numbers. There are probably at least 125 to 150 war crimes cases. Here we are. I am not trying to re-traumatize you, but my talk takes form today as a self-reflection in three parts. First, on pacing, on biorhythms of echo-chambered communities, of artists, professionals that don't speak to each other. Second, on tactics, the role of performing digital activists as opposed to just plain activists. And third, on reservoirs of feeling that are within the words we write, the unsaid but felt. This is our spectrum for Ukrainian history, for contemporary Ukrainian studies. This last one, Ukrainian studies, is stylized and complex. Why aspiring or accomplished academics connect to the people we connect to. Why we don't leave our topics. Why networks of privilege grow stale. Why we who teach don't listen. Part 1, time. In the time of 2022 history, Ukrainian scholars I'd respected who'd once taken buses, trains, and metros peacefully to work were forced to flee all the familiar spaces they knew. They rescued their parents and children. They called for arms deliveries, defense, NATO, and common skies to be protected. France fought on front lines, and I covered it since February 24th, 2014. Women too, with families in full panic. Journalists reached out as they donned protective gear, helped medics, or crawled in muddy trenches to be recaptured from Russian occupiers. I didn't know what the fuck to do. Did you? If anything at all. At the very least, I started tracking people, tracking accounts, over 5,000 now. I gave over maybe 50 talks or so and consultations, some in the middle of the night. My tractor went on autopilot because I stood in the United States, west-splaining from a position of privilege, away from the countries that I studied. I tweeted from Texas. I used the language of erasure that I, as a Jewish person, learned in studying the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, and genocide for and about Central and East European destructions and mass deaths and killings of populations. This was the new Ukrainian history. It was something I couldn't quite articulate about life and death. And so I wrote. In History and Time, February 24th, 2022 became a limit experience, a new scale of violence. Think about your reference points. What are your frameworks for this scale of violence? 1941 and 1939, transposed to Cold War 1962. Mariupol in 2022 to Aleppo, Grozny, Yemen, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, Guernica. No pasaran, more loosely a kind of Noah's Ark, a biblical time, 2 by 2, side by each, rescued from Ukraine. Atrocity journalists taken hostage in panic, disfigured bodies under rubble, targeted kindergartens, distant geopoliticians from America, from DC, who didn't feel anything. Why not? More great power pomposity, power-flattering siloviki from Moscow, oligarchs protecting Londonistan, future denizens of The Hague. Cross-border POWs, I won't show them for the Geneva Conventions. I don't care. Dogs, cats, bunnies, roosters, llamas, children in hospitals, people hiding in strip clubs, sliders down metros. Blown up churches, Babin Yar, and mosques, blocked trains, NATO defense, nuclear blackmail, crowded stations, rabbis fleeing and defending their peoples, wasted taxes, tractors pulling tanks, jokes, blood-soaked memes, despair, logic, we have to get out, and our whole families too. Flowers and fields of grain poisoned, profanity unleashed by the brightest fucking minds, voters and survivors, scraps of Metal Z junk. Ukraine will win. Near nuclear disaster, radiation, sunflowers, grain, water, soil. Russia is a terrorist state, hashtag, for that's what it was, and this is the content of my archive. My brave Texas graduate student from Dnipropetrovsk, already displaced with his family once in 2014, twittered at me on February 24th, 23rd, 24th at 4 a.m. He wrote, "I'm literally shaking, Dr. Seegel." He and I in Texas had been on a panel just a week earlier, week and a half, when historians spoke about off-ramps for Putin, how to sit at the long table with him. My Twitter archive captured these emotions for weeks and months. The threads by political scientists and tankies couldn't quite disguise the emotions. And so I watched the open source intelligence, I followed Ukrainian Telegram, and I tried to get my friends out if they wanted to get out. Observers like Michael Kaufman, if you follow him, predicted the invasion, and I had followed the buildup of troops from October, actually from November really, along the Belarusian border. Most of us underestimated Russian military prowess. How could they do this? My Ukrainian friends asked. I saw intelligence landscapes change where diplomats were much, much slower on the uptake, if you follow your Macron and Schultz. I feared the worst, and even now, I still do, despite my idealism and optimism. I watched the so-called special operation develop. I got trolled and stalked, but it's just me. Why does this matter for an American? I exchanged hundreds of messages in multiple languages with friends who asked me if they should flee Ukraine, get out of villages and into dachas, out of cities. Where should we go? Hide somewhere in Western Ukraine. I put out words on the Twitter feed like dictatorship, war crimes, and genocide. I argued that we needed to have a moral center, and I told my graduate student to tell his parents that it would be shock and awe like the Americans did in Baghdad on the morning of the 24th. Those were our American war criminals, and they still are. Huilo's lifelong sadism, what Anna Politkovskaya and Boris Nemtsov and others have known, the multi-prong and multi-city destruction, planned and executed with maps with intent. I noted that airports and strategic infrastructure would be the first to be hit, not just in Kyiv, but in other Ukrainian cities in the weeks that followed and months that followed through March and April. I urged my student, Misha, to tell his mom and dad in Dnipro either to get out or to take shelter immediately. Again, I'm just an academic. I've been in the field of Ukrainian studies. But before I became an academic, I was an activist. I wrote 3 books, all of which are about maps, which you can read, all of which deal significantly with Ukrainian science, history, geography, and many other things. I hated Twitter. I still hate Twitter. It is a waste of my time. I would really, really, really like to be sitting in a library writing my 4th and 5th books. I sleep very little. I police pundits and pretenders. I develop masks, hats, and registers. I pay attention to people who ask for help. And I carry a mental list sent to me by my friends here of people who need help out of Kharkiv and other places because I know how many risks they took. I wanted to say in public, this war is wrong. Let's be anti-war. But it's not enough. Нет войне. What comes next? You have to take action. Watch the Nazis. For there are Nazis in the world, Goebbels goons. And that's why we need a Ukrainian strong civil society, that the Ukrainians, in their last 5 revolutions, back to Chernobyl, the Granite Revolution, the Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, and February 2022, have boldly created. Our friends are in danger, so help us help them. Help us keep a society, build an international community that follows the rule of law, and prosecute those who don't listen to Ukrainians and who deserve to be damned. On February 24th, history failed when time stopped. I had a plan to mobilize and connect by the scholarly hundreds, then by thousands in the street. I take credit for none of this, but when I watch the protests in London or Berlin, I admire those people. And so I recorded them, using ethical tools, 115,000 tweets for lived history, and not likes, because, to quote Mustafa Naim, likes don't count. Who cares about likes? Do you need to be liked? If you're an activist, you don't think this way. History in rewind, or as Marcy calls it, in loops. Marcy Shore, drafts backward, correcting drafts, warnings of 1939 and 1914, drawing from Polish Solidarność in 1980-81, before martial law. Another martial law will come. Prague in 1968, before normalizacja, Belarusian women and labor strikes of August 2020, Mustafa Naim in November 2013, likes don't count, Tahrir, Eurasian color revolutions, Georgia 2008, messaging. For I worry about being a propagandist for causes I don't believe in. And so should you. Career suicide, precarity, post-precarity, post-post-precarity, from modern America into the worlds we have ruined in the West and in the United States of America since we became an empire, at least in 1898, or maybe 1619. I'm imbricated in this historical process, the world of empires, nations, borderlands, and transnational communities, because I and we dare call out evil. We Jewish people don't fit in, and we're not wanted. Revise revisions by dialogue, not pretext, peppered with Hannah Arendt, reviewing Wassily Grossman and Emanuel Ringelblum. Elitism, sadly, the inability to reach the populist communities. Narod, lud. Hoping to modulate in middles, to defend cultures against colonial aggression. Go to the people, Hajdiniev narod. Therefore, I tweet. And it doesn't work. And I message in a way that takes Twitter's toggles to other generationally inflected platforms. I speak for a transnational, decolonial Ukrainian studies community to win a war, to share language registers, to invoke human choice, to help in the aid process for those who need it in the millions, to file human rights cases, and find some path internationally with our tribunals, call them Nuremberg or not, Nuremberg II, for accountability and responsibility on behalf of people in silence and fear. So part 2, place, borderlands, frontier, Grenzle. I'm a geographer and a historian of ignored borderlands. I know how places that are cities, such as Odessa, Lviv, Kherson, Kharkiv, and Kiev, get privileged over the shtetl and the miasteczka, kehilot. How have all of these places and all of these peoples been mobilized? Who thinks about Crimea? I mobilized and I found paths to resistance. I tweeted out Ukrainian songs. You'll listen to Bordeland. He knows this. Songs are weapons against sirens, counter weapons, counter hegemonic maps. Chervona Kalina, fierce resistance, the power of the displaced to hold their cultures, victims of Bucha, Borodyanka, Bakhmut, Izium. Before February 24th, I was just a Ukrainian Jewish historian, or an East European historian, writing about the history of the earth sciences. How freaking boring. Ukrainians, after the 24th, are outnumbered by a Russo-centric scholarly industry and a Russo-centric publishing market with patience for Cold War détente and basic limits to human empathy and compassion. This is not to say we should exclude Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Absolutely not. One of my former advisors, actually, if you want my biography, I worked with Patricia Herlihy, who was a brilliant historian of Odessa. She lived to be 88 years old. She published 5 books, had 6 children, lived in Odessa, got the key to the city of Odessa. She loved to write about vodka. She had a book called Alcoholic Empire, which inspired me to learn about Russia and Ukraine. Pat told me once that she thought by studying Ukraine in the United States, there would be no opportunity for jobs, nothing. And she was wrong. So here I am to listen to you give me your stories of places and communities framed in disciplines and methods, places wiped off the map. Because nobody knows when Russia's genocidal war will end. What is Ukraine? I'll offer a working definition. Ukraine is a democratic country, independent since 1991, with a longer history of independence back to the years of the Ukrainian Revolution, during and after World War I, and back to the Hetmanate, the early modern Cossack state. Read your Serhiy Plokhy. Ukraine, not the Ukraine, was partitioned in the way that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned. If you remember your history, Rozbior Polski, 1772, 1793, 1795. Read your Butterwick Pawlikowski, or Norman Davies, or Timothy Snyder. Why is this important? Because Ukraine got partitioned again after Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity, with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the conquest of Donbass and Luhansk. And again in 2022 with the failed coup in Kyiv. Lives of Ukrainian citizens shouldn't have to wait for a third Minsk or a third partition. And how do we prevent that? Well, we write about how things get erased, entire communities. For example, the history of Armenians in Ukraine. Let's write about that. The history of Moldovan-Ukrainian relations. Let's write about that. The history of Jews fighting with Muslims on the front line. Let's write about that. These are future maps and future projects and books and reviews. And this is what I do, summoning Hannah Arendt, Emanuel Ringelblum, and Vasily Grossman. In the meantime, just on Twitter, I chronicle the war. And day by day, I work with journalists and bureau chiefs and activists, and I memorize accounts, and I note the fraudsters. And sometimes, if you're on these platforms enough, you learn how to outwit the algorithms, because the algorithms change quite a lot. And you see, for example, Ukrainian journalists from Ukrainska Pravda or Kyiv Independent, anyone with a flag who gets marginalized. And so we need to boost those accounts and that information. This requires a somewhat capacious memory for doing digital history, but I'm not a computer, and this is where I need your help. I am not AI. So in the digital humanities, or Slavic DH, this is where there's so much work to be done, to know the tools, to archive the sources, because this will be a war archive that will affect multiple generations for a century, if not more. And so for 487 days, I've set up stories of borders and borderlands for people who keep track in multiple languages, including, say, Japanese, about the developments in Ukraine. This is hard because I don't read Japanese. But we need support and global allyship. I keep track with Alexandra Matvichuk. I was on a panel with her, the Nobel Prize winner in London, keeping track of all kinds of documented cases for war crimes. I share maps and open source intelligence, think tank reports, investigations by Bellingcat and Insider. I watch in horror as Russian weapons become weapons of mass destruction and murder. And how many assassination attempts did President Zelensky face? I would say probably between 6 and 10. Putinists launched missiles to rain on Ukrainian churches, schools, museums, and apartment buildings. And to my mind, 2022 academics in their privileged corners of Western and Central Europe, not to mention my privileged corner of American ivory-towered academia, just didn't do enough. Academics in Germany and Russia and American Russianists in love with Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the Kremlin, and needing archives in St. Petersburg, didn't do enough. They were preoccupied with their status and careers. And so am I. White-collar jobs, children's tuitions, comfortable tenured professorships, and late lives where you can take vacations to Prague and Budapest. In this sense, Americans and Russians have a lot in common. We won't give up our worlds of racial and social privilege. While Ukrainians lost their lives, families, flats, and jobs, I wasn't happy. And so one of the first things I did on March 4th, 2022 was post this letter from one of our alumni professors of the summer school. And it went something like this. I posted it at 4:21 a.m. on March 4th, 2022. I'll read it because someday you might write one like this. Quote, March 4th, 4:21, anonymous. The Russian army cleans Ukrainian cities off the face of the earth, destroying key infrastructure so that there is no water, light, heat. Rescuers can't dismantle the debris under the shelling. The Russian army is squeezing the civilians out of the cities so that they can then fight the rest as if they are terrorists. Yesterday, many of my Kharkiv residents became refugees. This is what happens in life. Just yesterday, you were finishing an article and making plans for your vacation, and today you are standing with a bag at the station in Poltava, a good city. I've been trying to see it since long ago, with your scared children and a cat in a carrier. I didn't have time to pick up my mother. No gasoline, traffic jams and debris everywhere, burned cars, and again shelling. And there is a chance to start your life again with a clean leaf, but you are somehow not very happy about it. What's on my mind today? She writes. What is more terrifying than the destruction of my country? By the request of a nuclear button maniac will be a new world in which such crimes remain unpunished. The defeat of Hitler's Germany and the trial of Nazi criminals have created confidence in several generations of Europeans that there is a global moral order in which evil is punishable. But for justice to prevail, a military defeat of the criminal regime is necessary. And there are problems with that in the nuclear era. So, as soon as the maniac has a remission period, Western politicians will sit with him again at a very long table. This will be the collapse of the world order, the real end of history. The thought of my children and grandchildren having to live in this world of evil conquering makes me physically sick. Borderlands. In a place in 2022, our colleagues, like this in Ukraine, lost their homes, families, and livelihoods. And so my horrors and my traumas don't compare. It's not about the self. I spotlight Ukrainian poems in the book that I passed around. We'll read some of this. Songs, paintings, lectures, speeches, resistance movements, NGOs, and charitable organizations. Maybe some of you have worked with them NGOs, or at least contributed to them. For that, I'm grateful. I collected solidarity statements from academies of science, universities, including those in North America, US and Canada, together with the BASIS British academic, really German-British academic, Matthias Neumann. We did good work. In the beginning month of the war, we had statements from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and from other places, the American Historical Association, the British Academy, German universities, all denouncing the invasion. And in this appeal for global solidarity, on behalf of Ukrainians and their allies, Ukrainians, I think, are still the guiding stars. So let's not let their civil society be destroyed. It's not a matter of choosing one war or nation state over another, but there isn't moral equivalence. No pasarán. The Spanish Civil War, the Popular Front. Ukrainian journalists have every global and local right to be angry, to assign blame to perpetrators and deniers, because their borderlands and transnational worlds are worlds of resistance, north to south, east to west, grain trade to Africa, a hunger plan from the Kremlin. I mobilized this resistance, governed not by Kremlin BS history on the unity of Russians and Ukrainians, denying the existence of modern Ukrainian nationhood and statehood. Choices. Hopefully with ethics, and you've made one choice to be here today. So we are here among the resistance, overground and underground, if you look for us. Citizens must cross borders, and this is hard with security and surveillance and passport regimes. Citizens must move bodies, and our bodies have to hold criminals accountable by speaking out for the victims of perpetrated war crimes. Use your screen, multitask. Likes don't count. In terms of digital worlds, there are limits to our activism. We activists began by repairing the hearts that Putin ripped to shreds. We exposed to the public the tendrils of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian German, Ukrainian Polish, Ukrainian Russian, Ukrainian-Czech relations. And those bilateral and multilateral worlds are geographies of emotion, cooperation, not just academic conferences with coffee breaks. The I and the they, the micro worlds, the marriages, the relationships. Call it maps of time or maps of prejudice, like atlases of prejudice, like the Bulgarian anarchist Janko Cvetkov, his Atlas of Prejudice. I'll show some of those maps in my later lectures. These worlds of emotion and reason are academic, but it's why we love our friends and colleagues. Where corpses rot and sirens sound and scales are out of whack, there lies the intersection of history and geography, our maps with time. I believe in our actions for solidarity in Ukrainian studies, a field that's existed since the 1970s, if not the 1670s, despite what the Kremlin says. And so we need to learn the names. Shevchenko, Kotlяревsky, fine. How about Yakimchuk, Lutsishina, Zabushko? I wish I had a better solution today for contemporary Ukraine and transnational history than this Mayakovskian trauma bonding. For there are other traumas that bond and bind. Ukrainian history is a borderlands history, but Ukrainian history is also the history of a sovereign, independent country with a strong civil society and hopefully a constitutionally guarded rule of law. De-oligarchizatia, we can talk about that too. But for the meantime, I can't dismiss the portentous shame of Muscovites or New Yorkers who don't leave the island, who choose never to set foot in sacrifice zones like Donbass and Chernobyl. Russian torture chambers, prisons. I wish I could save the hostages, free Evan, or else stop tanks, the crematoria from rolling. It's true that there's one psychopath who can stop this from his bunker to the jet. Where will he go? Prigozhin couldn't get him. Yet unclaimed dumping grounds. I don't have the power of ministers to close the skies. F-16 jets. Businessmen are like czars, far away. So how do we affect their opinions? I just record it. I have a word processing machine. It collects open source intelligence and it crunches data. I get invited to speak on violence, genocide in Ukraine, and so this is it. Develop journalistic ethics, build portals for war crimes, know how to do oral history, write history books, as some of you already have. Books that once were catastrophic premonitions from 1939 or 1914. Don't write them when it's too late. Write them now. Books about corruption, up chains. Books about money in shadows, of crimes documented in Ukraine, committed by extraordinaries. Ordinary Russians in Rostov-on-Don. Children across borders, futures ruined, people kidnapped, refugees. 18 and 19-year-olds on special missions. Ethnic cleansing, famine, civilian deaths, Ukrainian history, lessons unlearned, genocide prevention that never works. Why aren't we reading Syrian history or paying attention to Chechnya in 1995? Abuses of the past, Bielye Pyatnie, blind spots, imperialism, territorial revisionism, ethno-nationalism, colonialism, pornography, subjugation, homophobic men, patriarchal societies of fantasies and fantasies of power and revenge since Stonewall, Putler's rage mimicked by little Putins, little Stalins, anger against women, LGBTQIA. Why are we targeted? What fuels us deftly through pride marches, powerfully in searches for multi-allied truth, reconciliation, progressive peace after victory, and defense of our territory. Captivity, severity, barbarity that never, ever ends against our bodies. What we do. Who is to blame? What is to be done? Part 3. Policy space and borderlands. Now, if you want to do something practical, read, but create lasting policy too. I'm a professor, a lobbyist, if you will, and a historian. Not everything reduces to maps and geopolitics, and this is why we need diplomats and people to run for public office. Because if you don't, you get authoritarians and dictators. That's the risk that all of us will face. So, master your digital tools, R, Python, Gephi, Web Recorder, ArcGIS. Master them. Learn them. Don't be afraid of your technological devices. I say this to people who are Gen Z and already know more than I do. You know more than I do. Gather funds, build archives, info, maps, data, intelligence, counterintelligence, open source, are years of expertise to seek to assist the victims of unspeakable horrors, illuminate diarists and writers, hold concerts, build worlds of song from the underground to the overground, anthologize, pay for violins, dance, accordions, sound systems, and pianos. Czerwona Kalina, resistance. Kalush, resistance. Give refugees education, homes, social services, and health. Gosh, this sounds like Don Quixote. Am I Don Quixote? Have memory. Get out of capital cities where people live gentrified lives. Some of these people might be your parents or grandparents until they're forced to migrate. Bubbles in cities. Know which words are useless babble in rubble. Study languages. Speak to diplomats. Focus on the marginalized and the names. 2. So what is to be done? Well, aim to reconstitute the European Union that won't allow your countries into it. Transatlantic security environments, like NATO, for all of its faults. Please arrest Putin and urge the South Africans to act. They didn't. They won't. The Goebbelsian goons who appear on state Russian media will someday be tried at the next Nuremberg, with or without the United States. In the Ukrainian studies field, read Georgian, Chechen, El Salvadoran, Nicaraguan, and Syrian history, not just Poland. Why? This is great. I lived in Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, and I wrote this, so, no offense. Multiple voices are the keys. Write the books. Look for volunteers. Build networks, not just big names. Because the multiple languages are what we need to do decolonial history and decolonial scholarship. Why Kazakh and Kyrgyz and Armenian and Crimean Tatar literature should be held with the greatest importance next to Tolstoyevsky. Account for positionality and intersectionality, subgroups in civil societies. Call out West-splainers like me who've been speaking to you for an hour. You're tired. Note fake accounts and grifters. It helps. Report unsourced news. It helps. Anchor yourself in those who deny your histories and engage them. Your body will be hurt in the process. The sirens haven't stopped. Still hear that? To conclude, on the lives of digital activists. The Kremlin is no match for us. In appealing for solidarity against aggression at this moment of no pasaran, Ukrainian journalists have center stage, and they should, to assign blame to perpetrators and deniers. I've argued that worlds of resistance have little to gain by analyzing what a lying dictator writes about history. Who cares what Putin says? Kremlin-based history of our transnational regionalism and borderlands is bankrupt. And so, in my Digital Activist February 24th archive, Now, with 25 million views per month, 120 cities, probably 7,000 threads, and people from really just all around the world making contributions, I've built bridges between 6 groups. 1, professionally trained field experts in Ukrainian, transnational, and borderland studies, language, poetry, culture, social and earth sciences, natural sciences. 2, interested non-specialists from graduate level to full professors. You don't need to be a professor in order to matter, because you can write and produce. I did podcasts, like 90 of them, for New Books Network. I interviewed people. 3rd, journalists, including open source amateurs and map makers. But these journalists, as you know, operate on different schedules. Journalists have no time. They have to file stories at 2 a.m., and then they get the next task. And if you're a military journalist, you put your helmet on, right, and you go out into the field, and you can be killed at any moment, and you still have to file the story the next day, preparing for The Hague. 4th, diplomats and policymakers whose attention we need, because they hopefully will be writing their reports and briefs based on our expertise. This really matters in the intelligence and civil service establishment. I cannot emphasize this enough. Know a diplomat. Get to know them. 5th, I hate to say it, but we need the capitalists too. So, again, as a labor activist and as a unionist, a trade unionist, I've had so many problems with this over the years, but we need the businesses for the reconstruction of Ukraine, so we'll see how that shakes out. And finally, number 6, a voting citizenry that crosses the lines of liberals, conservatives, moderates, progressives, and radicals. You've seen the uselessness of Chomsky's speeches or Mearsheimer's politics. All of our social and digital media polarizes, and in this sense, I've tried to act as a kind of policeman, but someone who's monitoring the process and collecting the most useful comments, analysis, memes, and threads. We require literary focus, empathy, sensibility, and responsibility, and I think in knowing our history, it matters to have a reference point of Central and Eastern Europe, the dissident movement, 1956, 1968, 1989, Václav Havel's Civic Forum, for example, Charter 77. Those are the histories that matter to me. This might sound like an American agenda. It is. We've built transnational and transatlantic partnerships, and I hope to build more. I'm one of those nasty democracy promoters from the 1990s. I had friends who worked for the Open Society and Soros Foundations. I think we did great work. And so I'm grateful for people who've asked how they can help. It's not just the money. All of these tools in front of you, GIS, Python, R, GitHub, Web Recorder, study which ways the algorithmic winds are blowing, because they blow, and the blowhards who speak blow the hardest. Every life requires choices. So let's start on February 24th and end with victory. Slava Ukraini! Wow, that's exactly 1 hour, 59 minutes. Improvisations. Вопросы, Fragen. Haben Sie Fragen, please?
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very comprehensive and interesting presentation. So I have 2 questions. So what is your opinion why now current borderland issues in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh is not highlighted that much as other countries?
Yeah.
And the second question, why international community sometimes make decision from subjective point of view, not objective, when it comes to borderland issues in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I've been thinking about Nagorno-Karabakh a lot. There's some really interesting work by, I'll start name dropping if you don't mind a little bit, and don't think that I'm dodging the question, but I really want to give this audience of summer school participants some Western scholarship. You can call it bias or prejudice, but I think it's very useful. So the work of Gerard Toll, T-O-A-L, I think is very good on Nagorno-Karabakh. Lawrence Broyers, who's also done important work on Nagorno-Karabakh. I think that the ignorance of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict right now accompanies this idea, which has become popular in American foreign policy circles, that Ukraine almost represents the saving of a civilization. So let's start with the blind spots. The idea that Ukrainians are like operating in the sort of bulwark of an Eastern civilization has a very long history. Back to the Antemorale Christianitatis, if you like read your 17th and 18th century history, a lot of that came out of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it was used in both Poland with Polish civilizational and colonial projects looking east, German history with the idea of a Lebensraum, Hungarian history in the conflict over Transylvania between Hungary and Romania. And so this Eurasia, if you will, like the difference between Europe and Eurasia, is a very, very deep prejudice. And like I remember having these arguments after reading Larry Wolff, because Larry Wolff is a really important historian and a cultural geographer and historian at NYU for me, about inventing Eastern Europe. I think that in many ways, the American policy and NATO and EU policy circles from Brussels and from DC are trapped in this civilizational barbarism map. And that means off the map right now is Nagorno-Karabakh. Off the map to some extent is Bosnia, if you're following Bosnian developments. So there's a privileging, obviously like Kosovo is a good example of this, right? So, if you're watching the Serbian president who speaks like Donald Trump in many ways about brokering territorial deals, I feel like we can have many, many conversations about the Azerbaijani government and what they're doing. The Armenian situation, you will probably be able to tell me more, but there's very, very little support right now for any kind of NATO expansion or NATO assistance to Armenia. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the Biden administration's reluctance to change the status quo. So if you have this mental map, if you will, this mentale Karten of like Eurasia versus Europe, Georgia versus Ukraine, inattention to Chechnya, Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We haven't even talked about Afghanistan yet. The foreign policy establishment has like come to the conclusion that the Nagorno-Karabakh question should be handled locally and regionally, and that I think is a huge mistake. But there's very little, I think, at least from the American point of view right now, that I see in terms of action for intervention. I don't really see an international, even a humanitarian aid situation happening right now. But this is not to say that academics are disengaged from the problem. There's foreign policy circles that I think are really interested in it. I hate this idea of the map of civilization where some peoples are kind of like placed higher or lower or in the middle. But in many ways, I think that this is how the policy environment is working. So that's kind of like the honest question to this. we can continue that conversation. I'd recommend the work of Breuers and Toll, and I can give some more references on geographers and historians and political scientists. So, some of them are following me on Twitter. The journalist Neil Hauer is also a very good follow, who's been covering it. Hauer, Hauer, Neil Hauer. Thanks for the question. It's just the beginning of our conversation. More questions? Pytanie. Proszę. I was really interested to hear your biographies, so like maybe if you want to ask questions about your expertise, go ahead, please. Could you introduce yourself one more time?
Yeah, sure. I'm Kate, and I'm from Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
You demonstrated the impressive awareness of the Ukrainian realities, frankly speaking, and it's very impressive for me to listen to such deep details. Thank you for this deep knowledge and for introducing this information to all of us. And my question is, do you use any Ukrainian resources to keep up with news? And can you please name these resources? What do you think are the most relevant?
Yeah, I think I rely a lot on journalists. So Euromaidan Press is one of them, Ukrainska Pravda, New Voice of Ukraine. I think Хочу в дому, like, you know, if you're following on Telegram, the different Telegram channels, this is really important for geolocations. I think for documenting war crimes, we can probably talk a little bit more about this, but the Center for Urban History in Lviv is doing really incredible work. Taras Nazaruk and Natalia Otrichenko, like, so they're putting together a huge war archive based on Telegram channels. I don't spend so much time on Telegram because I really hate Russian military bloggers who are just kind of like reporting the Z other side. I don't have the patience for that, and it's very disgusting for me to just hear so much of the xenophobia and like chauvinistic Russian rhetoric. But I rely on Ukrainian translators, so people who are working, I would say, as fixers or as reporters. I think the reporting is exceptional from Kharkiv. Maria Avdieva and Haya Koinash are just incredible journalists. Halia works with one of the oldest human rights organizations, the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection, KHPR, the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Agency. And, you know, like, they're getting reports about the deportations. There's really good Crimean Tatar activists. Luftia, I'm trying to remember her last name, but I'll find it in my Twitter accounts. You know, people who are covering Crimea, who are documenting cases of imprisonments among Crimean Tatar activists. I rely, I would say, probably on Kyiv Independent the most, because what Kyiv Independent does with Olga Rudenko, who's one of my heroes, round the clock, is they get, through that office in Kyiv, just the reports out in a cycle. And if you get the reports out in that 24-hour cycle while the missiles are falling, you know, the shaheeds that are being shot down between 1 and 5 a.m. with the air sirens, then you can get those reports immediately to Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Guardian, New York Times, Washington Post, all the Anglophone media, in addition to sort of like Die Welt or Deutsche Welle or Le Monde, El País. And like, what Kyiv Independent does was just so brilliant because they were not state media. They were actually like all volunteers, young people, technologically savvy Ukrainians of your generation, not mine, who were just working really, really hard around the clock with the sirens, with the Wi-Fi to get the reports out. So I would say, like, what I'm relying on, if you follow me on Twitter, is just a cycle to stay in the algorithm, and then certain individuals, journalists that I see are absolutely forces of nature. Because the last point I would make about this, since I passed around the Ukrainian Intellectuals book, if you're an academic or if you're a public intellectual, there really is something like a taboo about being on Twitter. if you're an academic, you should be publishing monographs with university presses and writing for prestigious journals. I have the time to do it because I'm just like a tenured American professor who's lived in Ukraine and studied Ukraine for over 20 years. So I rely on those journalists and writers. I mean, Stanislav Aseyev, for example, Serhiy Zhadan, Andrei Lyubka, poets, Bohdana Neborak, she's a really important writer. Victoria Amelina. I could just go down the list, but those are all the names of people. Kate Khan, who's American, was in Chernivtsi, now is in Kiev. People I really admire and respect. And if you can shift from language to language, like if you're going Russian to Ukrainian to English and then tweeting like Bohdana does in Ukrainian and English, it gets things out really, really fast. That's where to start, I'd say, just by following individuals, because a lot of times those Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian outlets are run by people who don't subscribe to the entire institutional worldview. I like to follow individual journalists at the New York Times rather than just the New York Times, because sometimes you'll have editorial decisions which are made above the heads, let's say, of individuals who are reporting in the field. And there's a lot of really good examples of this. Other outlets, I'd say, like Max Sidon, definitely follow. Christopher Miller, definitely follow. People who moved actually from the Moscow bureau to the Kiev bureau, because the New York Times was unreliable. From February to July, we actually really just had to pressure all of them to do the work from Kiev and not from Moscow. How are you going to report on Kiev from Moscow? It just doesn't make any sense. Amnesty International, what they did with Agnes Gallimard, I think was really shameful. Not listening to women journalists or Ukrainian journalists in the field who knew the situation a lot better than they did. So, I can give you the whole list, and you can look at my follower list, because that's how I really build the reporting day by day. Thanks for the question.
I quickly have a question about one of the journalists you mentioned. There's a journalist who I think is quite controversial for a lot of Ukrainians, Christopher Miller.
Yeah, I know, from 2014, and you can tell us why.
You know what I'm going to ask.
I know what you're going to ask.
If you could comment on that.
Yeah. So.
Maybe clarify.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Miller, if you read his book, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Chris Miller, but he was one of those in 2014 who really contributed to the misinformation and disinformation environment, and I think this is safe to say. So the idea that Ukrainians are like Bandorivtsi or Bandorovtsi and are, executing through Azov some kind of Nazi movement. There's a longer history to this, as we know, those of us who are writing Ukrainian Jewish Polish history of the UPA and OUN and Ukraine's role as collaborators during Holocaust with Bandera. So, the idea of Bandera as a freedom fighter is extraordinarily controversial, and Ukrainian historians like Olesia Hromiechuk, like John Paul Hiemka, really, really good work. Omer Bartov, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which started in Canada in 2008. We'd been writing about this for a very long time. I guess what Chris left out in his reporting was the historical background. And so what I sought to do, because all of it was Azov all the time, Miller, Rogozin, those sorts of people who subscribed to the Kremlin line or framed it as part of the Russian liberal opposition, that was a big mistake. I really think that the journalists who centered a particular aspect of Ukrainian nationalism should be held accountable for their words and for their statements. And it's fruitful to me to hold those conversations as an academic in some kind of civic platform or civic forum where you invite the journalists and say, вот, ошибки. These were mistakes, фейлен, that you made. Why did you just report on that? But I think as an investigator working for the Financial Times with a lot of fixers on the ground, he's a very good journalist. Very good. It's just that sometimes you wonder why journalists develop their prejudices and why they have a brand and focus on things only on that for such a short amount of time. One of the good reasons for this is because journalists often, they go through what I would call like a grifter stage. You're seeking as a freelancer to find some kind of permanent employment, and you need to kind of like emphasize the controversial nature of what you're doing in order to get the attention. Once you've got the attention, you can then sort of moderate it, and then it's fed through almost like a process of editorial and peer review. Your editor is not going to let you write something that's totally crazy and off the wall, that there has to be more context to it. So I'm not making any excuses for him, but he's a journalist that I think is admirable despite what the Ukrainians are arguing at the moment. Yes, frankly. I follow him. I really do. But there are other voices. I mean, my approach to this, like public-facing digital work, has been polyphonic in the way that Edward Said wrote about polyphony in his essays, and since Orientalism was published in 1978. Polyphony is a stronger Ukrainian, pluralistic, liberal Ukrainian civil society. If you allow multiple voices, then you don't get the reduction to two, like a red-blue map. Trump, Biden, Prigozhin, Putin, liberal opposition. Once you fall into those categories, you're bereft of choices. And so for me, like the Ukrainian media environment has just been overwhelmingly inspiring, despite the oligarch's role back to the Orange Revolution and really back to 1991. We can hold many more of these conversations, but I think pluralism is a strength of Ukrainian society, and the relations between Western journalists and Ukrainian journalists and fixers is problematic, but that's a strength of Ukrainian society rather than a weakness. It's my rose-colored liberal glasses.
Normally transparent.
Yours are transparent. No, it's a strength. I mean, in Poland, it's completely different, right? In Poland, you have state media. You have a ruling party. In Hungary, you have a captured media, for the most part. Not so in Ukraine. And that's a strength. It's actually a model for other democracies. Media ownership, we can talk about that too, but I think between the press coverage, which has really improved since at least June and July of 2022 and now, it's amazing to me to see the New York Times graphics team put together the filtration camp report. It was amazing to me in July of 2022 to see the Washington Post actually investigate the 3 scenarios for the coup, for the Kremlin coup against Zelensky, and let's be honest, assassination of Zelensky. That took a lot of sourcing and a lot of background investigation and a lot of reading. Yeah, we can talk about that. Sorry, that's kind of like the inside perspective. I know a lot of these journalists personally too, so it's hard for me to say because I know that there's this external or extrinsic process of reviewing their work. There's one report that's read and it says, oh, okay, this is an apology for Kremlin propaganda. But then there's another report that they file which is more Ukrainophilic or more pro-Zelensky or something like that. If you take the whole body of work, if you do a data analysis and a corpus, then you get an analysis that leads in a different and I think fairer direction. That's why we need DH. It's why we need the sort of technology right now to study the words. If you take all of Putin's speeches, you look at all of Putin's speeches and you see how Ukraine appears or you see how the different words and phrases appear. You can do the same with journalists. So yeah, I recommend them. Study them. Yes, Hugh.
Hi, thank you for your powerful talk. I just have 2 questions. First one, because I'm also in Ukrainian studies, I was a teaching assistant for the course about Ukrainian history and politics in our institution.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how you, because now we really need to amplify the Ukrainian voices, and I was just wondering how you balance yourself between, because as a non-Ukrainian scholar in Ukrainian studies, how do you balance to, at the same time, sharing knowledge about Ukraine, but without taking too much?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because if you know me or have seen me, it's very rare that I speak. Actually, what I'm doing most of the time is boosting people and amplifying people. I'm non-ethnic Ukrainian. I have no ethnic heritage tied to Ukraine at all. None. So, does that make me less qualified to speak about Ukraine? Maybe. I have thought that the primary goal, since I studied at Harvard in 2000, Ukrainian history, literature, politics, really has been just to promote and argue for the critical promotion of Ukrainian studies. I call it Ukrainian studies because I work and I am trained as a historian of geography and cartography. Tim Snyder, was in my class at Harvard. We studied Ukrainian together in advanced Ukrainian in 2000. And for non-ethnic Ukrainians, at least in the United States, Ukraine, it was an intellectual project, but it wasn't a fantasy, if you know what I mean. There are fantasies of political geography, like those, on the far right in American politics, like Josh Hawley or Donald Trump or Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are arguing for the defunding of Pentagon aid, U.S. defense budget aid to Ukraine. For them, Ukraine is not a real country. It's just another one of those faraway countries, a country of which we know nothing, like as they described Czechoslovakia in 1938, or monsters to destroy, as John Quincy Adams in U.S. foreign policy described in the Quincy Institute, right? It's named after this in 1821. So the American isolationists or nativists or America First pacifists, peace activists, they're willing to let Ukrainians surrender to Russian occupation. And I think Ukrainian studies needs not just Ukrainian voices, because the diaspora is very strong and very highly developed in North America. I admire the diaspora in Ukraine, beyond Ukraine, quite a lot. I think they've created forums in Toronto, Boston, New York, and many, many other cities for doing the kind of work that we do, and ultimately making sure that our work is organized toward diplomacy and public policy as much as it's organized toward literature, the liberal arts, and humanities. I think, honestly, like if you're talking about the role of public intellectuals, Tim Snyder's books that he wrote, A Polish Artist's Mission to Liberate Ukraine, The Reconstruction of Nations, Bloodlands, those are really important books, but they're not the only books. They're not the only books. So within the environment in Switzerland, as Alexei can tell you about, or in other places, as Svetlana and Artem can talk to you about, in Israel, in Poland, in Germany, those are also the places for developing Ukrainian studies so that non-ethnic people can do the history and then talk about the need for decolonialization, to put Ukrainian history next to Thai history, or Korean history, or Taiwanese history, or Algerian history. I mean, think of the books that can be written about Chilean-Ukrainian relations. Why are we not there yet? Right? Or Argentine-Ukrainian relations, or a comparison of Spain after Franco with Ukraine after Putin, whatever it might be, dictatorships and democracies. This is really promising to attract more people intellectually to the field. And the very fact that you're here from China is really inspiring to me, honestly. I see so many parallels between, say, like Ukrainian history and Taiwanese history, or Ukrainian Hong Kong history. I think these can be explored. Hiroaki Kuramiya is another name that I would mention, someone who's a Japanese historian and expert on Donbass, who's originally from Tokyo. He wrote books on, if we're talking about East Asian history, Kuramiya trained a generation of graduate students at Indiana University who wrote about the purges, Donbass, industry, all kinds of really, really important books. Polish-Japanese diplomatic relations, Japanese-Chinese, Polish diplomatic relations from Piłsudski on. There's so much to be done. There's so much to be written. So, yeah, those are some of the things I would say. More questions? Let's just keep going. I'll go until I'm tired and you want food. When you're starting to get hungry, tell me, please.
You could tell us about what has changed in Western academia since
Yeah.
before, because so far Western academia has been dominated by, like, you have Russian studies, and Eastern European Russian studies, and it's dominated by Russian studies. Actually.
Yeah.
And even those who focus on other regions, or Georgia or Central Asia or Eastern Europe, it's easier just from Russian
Correct.
view, because Russian is a main language they know, so they consult Russian sources and
Yeah.
secondary literature and all this. But I see that there is some kind of change. It's superficial, but so far they're trying to refocus, but with these limitations.
Yeah.
But how it is now to be an Ukrainian studies scholar in USA?
Oh,
Have there opened much more chances? I don't know.
yeah, thank you.
For this perspective. And the second point is you also mentioned about solidarities between, for instance, when you study Ukrainian history, do you also read Armenian history or Kyrgyz history and so on? And
Yeah.
it's very interesting because when we talk about decolonization or decentering history, from Russian point of view, it's not just one Russia. There's a Tsarist Russia, there's a Soviet Russia, which
Yeah.
are different kind of imperial manifestations,
Right.
different political economic entities, and also these entities unfolded in different ways in Central Asia, also so East Europe.
Yeah,
It doesn't mean
I agree with you.
they're unfolding and you need to, it makes it better, it makes kind of more comprehensive to understand it.
Yeah.
Look how its mechanisms,
Mhm.
how the rise in different regions, and in this view, yeah. And last point, maybe you mentioned about transnational and colonial Ukrainian studies. What do you mean by this?
Sure.
These are all interrelated.
Sure. Thank you for those questions. Those are really smart questions, Maya, and I'm glad for that. I'll give you the short answer. I think, first, if you're going to study the decolonization agenda, this is not just the Helsinki Commission in DC. Obviously, you know this as someone with a degree in Indian history. There's a longer history for subaltern studies and for post-colonial studies back to the 1970s and 1980s. There are also really important books like, for example, Dipesh Chakrabarty or Partha Chatterjee, these books that were written by often Indian feminist Marxist commentators. And I think that tradition needs to be incorporated into 2022 or post-2022 decoloniality. So, as a contemporary example, there was just this very, very interesting conference with Oksana Dudko in Canada at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. And the conference, of course, opens with the acknowledgement of First Nations and Indigenous communities and the understanding that the land is occupied by white colonial European settlers. This is the first moment that you have to have in any conference to change that mentality, that you're actually saying, if you're a Caucasologist or someone who's working in Ohio, that you're going to begin by acknowledging that this land and this territory that you're speaking about and on is not yours. So I think that's an extraordinarily important sort of moment. And in the Caucasus, if you read, books like Krista Goff, I did a podcast interview with Krista Goff, who is a American historian in Florida, I think that it's really crucial to have a kind of like working module or working syllabus that Professor Dudko and others, Manuel Ferez, Mayhill Fowler, those who are participating in this conference did. And this was just a month ago in Canada. So, I mean, it's not just listening to Ukrainians or listening to West-splainers, because we already know who the common West-splainers are. It's following Central East European feminist networks, scholarship as it develops, and then recognizing this tradition of post-colonialism, decolonialism, anti-colonialism, back to the radical traditions, subaltern traditions in the 1980s and 1990s. And we build our lists in some ways, like out of that. On the other point, Russian studies, gosh, like this is the Pandora's box. Funding, money. We can't find jobs, those of us in Ukrainian studies. So, we're outnumbered in the publishing world 8-2 or 9-1. And then we're actually sort of told from often, this is the lowdown history from the 1970s and 1980s, you get from the Harvard Ukrainian Institute and other places. It was left to the diaspora often to just like find some oligarch or to find some person in Canada or North America and then raise the money and then create the jobs, like create a chair of Ukrainian history or Ukrainian studies. This is terrible. To me, it's just offensive that you can have Russian and Soviet studies specialists who are doing some kind of universal great power history, going to Moscow, St. Petersburg, developing all of these partnerships, and here we were kind of like in a corner, insisting that we need to learn Armenian, Georgian, Yakut. I have Yakut taught at my university. We have Czech, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, Romanian, Yiddish, Persian, Farsi, Arabic. I participate in the center that I run together with Mary Newberger, my boss, who's a Balkan specialist on Bulgaria and Macedonia. We're just trying really, really hard to fill the seats with bodies, because in a capitalist environment, like, that's the problem. People just get lazy and they want to sit and read Crime and Punishment, right? Преступление и наказание, and learn Russian when they should be reading Words for War or Aseyev or something that's much more important and more relevant to the current context. That's what has to change. I don't want to be dependent on like Pinchuk or Kolomoisky or some kind of rich oligarch in the West to have Ukrainian studies stay afloat. That's terrible. It's terrible. And I'm waiting, in many ways for the prominent people who are Russian speakers in New York, like the Masha Gessens of the world, to promote us, but they don't. And unfortunately, it's left for people like Kate Surkan and Apophenia and the journals that I'm constantly, hoping to promote, and I do. I boost them. I boost the translators. Vitaly Chernetsky and I, we're just constantly trying to figure who's the president of the American Association for East European Studies. As a Ukrainian from Odessa, we're just trying really, really hard to build that community against a lot of forces of people who either don't want to help us publicly or, for whatever reason, think that Ukrainian studies is somehow secondary and marginal. But my larger argument has been to promote Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia together, to get out of that Moscow-centered and St. Petersburg-centered world. That's the quick answer to this. Other questions on that very optimistic note that we're outnumbered 9-1? We need more translators, actually. I mean, people who are translating books, poetry collections, chapbooks, music histories, like Bogdan. I would hope that once your book gets published with the University of Toronto Press, that it's quickly translated by Duchy Litera or something into Ukrainian and Polish. My books are being translated now into German and Russian, which is kind of interesting. Academic Studies Press, if you follow Academic Studies Press, has sort of like all these different niches for Jewish studies, Ukrainian studies, Lithuanian studies. I think that's promising, but it's really hard often with enrollment to find the market for people who want to do something other than read Vaina i Mir, War and Peace.